Welcome to The Real Reads Review, your go-to podcast for engaging, conversational reviews of nonfiction books review. We dive deep into the real stories, big ideas, and powerful insights shaping our world today. Whether you're a curious reader or just looking for your next great read, this is the place to explore the books that matter. Let's get into it.
Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive today into how we learn a fascinating book by neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene.
Oh, absolutely.
And today we're going to really unearth the most intriguing nuggets about how our brains really learn best.
Right.
And I think you might be surprised by what we discover today.
Well, it's so interesting right from the beginning because Dehaene dismantles this age-old blank slate theory.
Yeah.
And he shows us that babies aren't just these empty vessels waiting to be filled with knowledge.
Right.
They come pre-wired with some pretty serious mental capabilities.
It's like they come with some apps already installed and ready to go.
Absolutely.
Like even tiny babies understand that if you hide a toy under a blanket that it still exists.
Right.
That's object permanence.
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
Babies can even discriminate between small quantities like 2 versus 3 objects, which shows like an early number sense.
Wow.
And what's even more amazing is that they even exhibit an early grasp of probability and social cues. So they can figure out who's trustworthy and even predict what might happen next.
That's amazing.
And all of this before they can even say a word.
So they're not starting from scratch. They're already building on a foundation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so how do we actually learn new things and build upon this foundation? What is that process?
So Dehaene has this compelling analogy to explain this, and he says, our brains operate like scientists.
Oh, okay.
Constantly forming hypotheses, making predictions based on what we already know, and then testing those predictions against what we observe in the world around us.
So our brains are kind of running these mini experiments all the time.
Precisely. And just like a scientist, when our brain's predictions don't match up with reality, that's where the real learning kicks in.
Okay.
So think about a baby touching a hot stove for the first time.
Yeah.
Their hypothesis that all surfaces are safe to touch is immediately challenged.
Ouch.
And this error detection mechanism, as Dehaene calls it, is fundamental to how we adapt and learn.
So that explains why passively listening to a lecture or just skimming through a textbook without really engaging with the material doesn't lead to really effective learning.
Exactly. If we're not actively making and testing predictions, our inner scientist isn't really getting much work done.
Right, because they're just being a passive observer.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay, so Dehaene highlights these 4 key pillars that are crucial for making learning stick.
Yes.
Attention, active engagement, error, feedback, and consolidation.
Yes. Think of them as the foundation of a sturdy house.
Okay.
Each one playing a critical role.
Let's take a closer look at each of these, starting with attention.
Okay.
I can't imagine learning anything if I'm not focused. But how does attention actually work in the brain?
So imagine a spotlight illuminating a specific area on a stage.
Okay.
Attention works in a similar way, enhancing the signals that are important for learning and filtering out all the distractions that might be vying for our brain's resources.
So it's really kind of honing in on one thing.
Yes, and that's why trying to study with a million things going on around you is often a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Your brain's attention is divided, and that inner scientist can't concentrate on the experiment at hand.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so attention sets the stage, but what about active engagement?
Right.
I'm guessing this is where we actually roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty with the information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's the difference between simply reading a recipe and actually getting into the kitchen and baking the cake.
Okay.
You need to interact with the information, manipulate it, test it out, and see how it works in practice.
So instead of just highlighting passages in a textbook, I should be asking myself questions, making connections to other things I already know.
Right.
Or even trying to explain the concept to someone else.
You're getting it. Those are all excellent examples of active engagement.
Okay.
And the beauty of it is that when you actively engage with information, you're far more likely to encounter those valuable errors that drive learning.
Which brings us to error feedback. You know, I used to think making mistakes meant I wasn't getting something.
Right.
But Dehaene suggests that errors are actually crucial for learning.
That's right. Think back to the brain as a scientist analogy.
Yeah.
Errors are like those unexpected results in an experiment.
Okay.
They tell us that our current understanding is incomplete or inaccurate and that we need to revise our hypotheses.
So they're like signposts guiding us towards a more accurate understanding.
Precisely.
So instead of feeling discouraged when I make a mistake, I should embrace it as an opportunity to learn.
Exactly.
But just knowing that I messed up isn't enough. I need specific feedback to figure out where I went wrong and how to correct course.
Absolutely. Imagine a student taking a multiple choice test and only receiving a grade with no indication of which questions they answered incorrectly.
Right.
That's not very helpful, is it?
No, not at all.
They need to know specifically where they stumbled so they can focus their efforts on those areas and improve their understanding.
So this is really giving me a whole new perspective on how I approach studying. Maybe instead of just passively reviewing my notes, I should incorporate more active recall strategies.
Right.
Like quizzing myself to identify any gaps in my knowledge.
Now you're thinking like a neuroscientist.
I love it. And that brings us to the final pillar.
Yes.
Consolidation.
This is where all that hard work of paying attention, engaging with the material, and learning from our mistakes gets cemented in our brains.
This is where sleep comes into play.
Yes.
I've always heard about how important sleep is for learning, and Dehaene dives into the fascinating details of how it all works.
Sleep isn't just about resting our bodies.
Right.
It's an active period where the brain is hard at work.
Really?
During sleep, our brains replay experiences, strengthening important connections.
Wow.
And even pruning away unnecessary ones.
So it's almost like the brain is tidying up its workspace and organizing all the new information it's gathered.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like when I wake up after a good night's sleep and a problem that seemed impossible the night before suddenly has a clear solution.
Yes.
It feels almost magical.
Dehaene describes how sleep facilitates memory transfer, shifting information from short-term storage to long-term memory.
Oh, wow.
And it's also a time when the brain can make unexpected connections, leading to creative insights and aha moments.
That's a fantastic reminder to prioritize sleep, not only for our physical well-being, but for our cognitive abilities and learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking maybe pulling all-nighters isn't the best strategy after all.
Definitely not. And it's not just the quantity of sleep that matters, but also the timing.
Oh, okay.
Dehaene suggests reviewing material right before sleep to prime the brain for consolidation.
Well, that's a good tip.
And he even challenges the idea of early school start times.
Yeah.
Particularly for adolescents whose sleep patterns are naturally shifted later.
We could explore that further, but for now, let's shift our focus back to the brain itself.
Okay.
One of the most incredible concepts Dehaene explores is this idea of neuronal recycling.
Ah, neuronal recycling. This is where things get truly remarkable.
Okay.
Dehaene argues that our brains are remarkably adaptable. Instead of passively waiting for new information, they actively repurpose existing neural circuits for new skills.
Wow.
Particularly those that didn't exist in our evolutionary past, like reading and math.
So our brains are like master tinkerers.
Yes.
Taking these ancient circuits designed for things like recognizing faces or navigating forests and rewiring them to decode letters and solve equations.
Precisely. Consider reading, for example.
Okay.
Dehaene describes how the visual word form area,
Okay.
that's the part of the brain specialized in recognizing written words, develops in a region already wired for visual object recognition.
Huh.
It's as if your brain says, hey, this area is great at recognizing shapes. Let's adapt it a bit to handle letters, too.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It means our brains didn't evolve an entirely new section just for reading.
Right.
They're adapting on the fly.
Exactly. And the same goes for math.
Really?
Dehaene explains how mathematical thinking recruits circuits originally used for spatial reasoning and quantity estimation.
So the skills we learn are actually building upon the pre-existing architecture of our brains.
Exactly.
If our brains are so good at repurposing existing circuits, are there limits to what we can learn? Is there anything our brains are simply incapable of handling?
That's a great question. While Dehaene doesn't explore the limits of learning in great depth, he does emphasize that understanding neuronal recycling can inform our educational approaches.
So instead of trying to teach skills in isolation,
Right.
maybe we should be looking for connections to things our brains are already good at.
Exactly.
For instance, if we can link new math concepts to spatial reasoning, it might make those concepts easier to grasp for students.
Exactly. It's all about working with the brain, not against it.
I like that. And speaking of working with the brain, Dehaene highlights the significance of early childhood as a period of heightened brain plasticity.
Yes, this is a crucial time.
This is the use it or lose it phase, right?
Precisely.
The time when the brain is most adaptable and receptive to new experiences.
During early childhood, the brain forms tons of new connections, and those connections are constantly refined based on the child's experiences.
Wow.
It's like a sculptor molding a piece of clay. The earlier you start, the more pliable the material is.
So those early years are crucial for developing foundational skills like language sensory processing and social cognition.
Absolutely.
It really highlights how important it is to provide young children with rich and stimulating environments.
Dehaene strongly advocates for early intervention programs and emphasizes the importance of creating environments where children can freely explore, experiment, and learn from their mistakes.
That's reassuring. While those early years are critical, I'm guessing it's not all downhill from there.
Right.
We can still learn new things throughout our lives, right?
Absolutely. While the brain's plasticity does decrease with age, it never completely vanishes.
Very good.
And as Dehaene points out, understanding how the brain learns can help us learn more effectively at any stage of life.
So it's never too late to become a better learner.
Never too late.
Now, Dehaene dedicates a good portion of the book to discussing how these insights from neuroscience can be applied to improve education. And this is where his argument for evidence-based education comes in.
Yes. He firmly believes that educational practices should be rooted in a solid understanding of how the brain actually learns.
Okay.
It's about moving away from relying on tradition or intuition and instead using scientific evidence to inform teaching methods and curriculum design.
This reminds me of how medicine has evolved over the centuries. We've transitioned from practices like bloodletting and using leeches to treatments grounded in a deep understanding of human biology.
Right.
Dehaene seems to be calling for a similar revolution in education.
You could say that he advocates for teaching methods that align with the brain's natural learning mechanisms.
Oh, yeah.
For instance, he's a strong proponent of active learning-spaced repetition and regular low-stakes testing as ways to enhance learning and retention.
So ditch the long passive lectures and cramming sessions and embrace interactive learning, spreading out study sessions, and using quizzes as learning tools rather than just assessments.
Exactly. It's all about working smarter, not harder, by harnessing the inherent strengths of our brains.
And speaking of strengths, Dehaene highlights something uniquely human that gives us a massive learning advantage.
Yes.
Our social nature.
Humans are incredible social learners.
Yeah.
We're wired for shared attention, imitation, and cultural transmission.
Think about how babies learn language.
Right.
It's not just passive absorption of words. They're actively engaging with their caregivers, paying attention to their gaze, imitating their sounds, and picking up on social cues.
It's an incredibly efficient way to learn.
It really is.
Dehaene refers to this as natural pedagogy.
Oh, okay.
And it extends far beyond language acquisition.
Okay.
We learn by observing others, imitating their actions, and sharing knowledge within our social groups.
So it's really how culture is transmitted and how we build upon the knowledge of past generations.
Precisely.
It's like we have this incredible built-in network of mentors and collaborators constantly feeding our brains with new information.
Exactly.
What a superpower.
It is.
But even with all this social learning going on, there's still something to be said for individual exploration and curiosity, right?
Absolutely. Dehaene stresses that curiosity isn't just a nice to have. It's a powerful driving force behind learning.
Okay.
It's what motivates us to seek new information, explore uncharted territory, and make sense of the world that surrounds us.
And I imagine this connects back to the brain's reward system and that wonderful neurotransmitter dopamine.
You got it. Our brains are wired to seek novelty and challenge.
Okay.
When we come across something new and intriguing, our dopamine circuits light up, giving us a little burst of pleasure that reinforces the learning process.
I could see that.
It's why we're naturally drawn to things that are just challenging enough.
Yeah.
Not too easy, not too difficult.
Right.
That sweet spot where we feel like we're making progress and expanding our knowledge.
So embracing our curiosity and exploring our interests isn't just about having fun.
Right.
It's about tapping into our brain's natural reward system and making learning more engaging and effective.
Precisely. And this leads us to another vital point, the role of errors in learning.
Okay.
We briefly discussed this before.
Right.
But Dehaene really drives home the idea that mistakes are not the enemy. They're crucial for growth.
I like that.
It's like the saying, we learn more from our failures than our successes.
Yes.
But why is that? Why are errors so valuable from a neuroscientific perspective?
I'm curious.
Remember, our brains are constantly generating predictions.
Yes.
When those predictions are wrong, that's when the error detection mechanism kicks in and triggers learning.
Okay.
It's like a feedback loop telling us, something's not quite right here. Let's adjust our understanding.
So rather than viewing errors as setbacks, we should view them as valuable feedback, guiding us toward a more accurate understanding of the world.
Exactly. And this connects back to the idea of a growth mindset, which Dehaene also touches upon.
Right.
When we embrace errors as opportunities to learn, we become more resilient, more willing to take risks, and more persistent when faced with challenges.
It's about shifting our perspective from I'm not good at this,
Yes.
to I'm not good at this yet.
Exactly. It's a subtle shift in thinking,
Yeah,
but it can have a huge impact on our learning journey.
it really can. Now, to wrap up this section of our deep dive, let's explore some practical learning strategies based on the science of memory.
Okay.
Dean discusses a few particularly effective techniques such as spaced repetition, retrieval practice, and interleaving.
These are all great tools.
So spaced repetition is all about reviewing information at increasing intervals, right?
That's correct.
Like seeing a flashcard today, then again in a few days, then a week later, and so on.
Yes. And this technique works so well because it forces your brain to work a little harder each time to retrieve the information.
Okay.
The more effort you invest in recalling something, the stronger the memory becomes.
So it's not just about passive exposure to the information, it's about actively engaging with the material and testing ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where retrieval practice comes in.
Okay.
Instead of just rereading notes or passively listening to a lecture, actively try to recall the information from memory.
So things like flashcard self-testing, or even just attempting to explain a concept to someone else without looking at your notes can be really helpful.
Absolutely.
And then there's interleaving.
Yes, which involves mixing up different topics or types of problems during study sessions.
Okay, so instead of doing all the math problems in one block and then switching to history,
Right.
we should alternate between different subjects or types of problems.
Precisely. This prevents your brain from getting complacent and encourages it to make connections between different concepts.
It's like cross-training for your brain.
Exactly.
These strategies are incredibly fascinating.
They are.
It makes me realize how much of learning is about strategy,
Yes.
about understanding how our brains function and using that knowledge to optimize our learning process.
And that's a key takeaway from Dehaene's book.
Yeah.
He argues that understanding the neuroscience of learning can empower us to become better learners regardless of our age or background.
It's like having a user's manual for our own brains, a set of tools and techniques that can help us unlock our full learning potential.
Exactly. And this understanding can transform not only our personal learning, but also how we approach education, parenting, and even workplace training.
Dehaene's book is a treasure trove of insights into how our brains learn best.
It is.
It reminds us that learning isn't just about acquiring knowledge.
Right.
It's about understanding how our brains work and using that knowledge to become more effective, engaged, and joyful learners throughout our lives.
And one of his core messages is that anyone can be a good learner. You know, it's not about some predetermined talent or intelligence. It's about understanding these learning principles and applying them consistently.
So whether we're, tackling a new language or picking up a musical instrument or just aiming to be more effective learners in our daily lives, understanding how our brains tick can really give us an edge.
That's what I find so inspiring about his work. He manages to take these complex neuroscientific ideas and distill them into practical takeaways that any of us can use,
It's like he's pulling back the curtain on the brain, showing us it's not some mysterious, impenetrable entity,
Right.
but an organ we can actually understand, nurture, and even optimize.
It's not about rote memorization or mind-numbing drills. Dehaene reminds us that learning should be a joyful process of exploration and discovery and the satisfaction of connecting the dots and broadening our understanding of the world.
So it's all about embracing our curiosity, celebrating those inevitable stumbles, and remembering that learning is an adventure that we get to enjoy throughout our lives.
Perfectly put. And I think it's worth circling back to a point we touched on earlier, the importance of early childhood.
Yeah.
Dehaene dedicates a significant part of the book to this critical period, underlining how crucial these early years are for shaping the brain's very architecture and laying the groundwork for all future learning.
There's that saying, as the twig is bent, so grows the tree. The experiences we have in those first few years have a profound impact on how our brains develop and how we learn throughout our lives. It makes you realize how much responsibility we have to get it right.
Dehaene highlights how certain skills like language and sensory processing are particularly sensitive to those early experiences. Think of it like windows of opportunity when the brain is primed for certain types of learning. If we miss those windows, it can be much harder to catch up later on.
It's like learning a second language. The kids who are exposed to multiple languages early on just seem to pick them up effortlessly, while adults often struggle even with dedicated effort.
That's a perfect example, and it's not limited to language. The same principle applies to other cognitive skills. Take the visual system, for instance. It's incredibly malleable in early childhood. If a child has a vision problem that isn't addressed early on, it can have lasting impacts on their visual development.
That makes me think about how vital early intervention programs are for children with developmental delays or disabilities.
Mm.
The sooner we can offer support and targeted interventions, the better the chances are for positive outcomes.
Dehaene is a huge advocate for early intervention. He stresses how important it is to create stimulating environments for young children packed with opportunities for exploration, play, and social interaction.
It seems like there's this complex interplay between genetics and experience, especially in those early years. It's a reminder that we have a shared responsibility to provide all children with the support and resources they need to thrive.
Absolutely. And while those early years are undeniably critical, it's important to remember that learning is a lifelong journey. Our brains maintain some level of plasticity throughout our lives, allowing us to continue learning and adapting as we age.
Oh, that is good news. It means we're not stuck with the neural wiring we developed in childhood. We can still grow, learn new skills, and even rewire our brains to some extent through new experiences and effort.
Dehaene talks about how learning new things, challenging ourselves mentally, and engaging in activities that stimulate our brains can help preserve cognitive function and even enhance neuroplasticity as we get older.
So it's never too late to learn that new language. Pick up a musical instrument or challenge ourselves with a brain-bending puzzle. It's not just about keeping our minds sharp. It's about actively shaping our brains and promoting our own cognitive growth.
Now let's revisit that fascinating concept of neuronal recycling we discussed earlier. Do you recall how our brains become master repurposers, taking old neural circuits and rewiring them to handle new
Oh,
things?
I definitely remember neuronal recycling. That's where our brains take those ancient circuits designed for things like recognizing faces
Yeah.
and adapt them to handle modern skills like reading.
You got it in.
Yeah.
Dehaene argues that our brains aren't sitting around passively waiting for new information. They're actively adapting those existing neural circuits to support new skills and knowledge, especially those that didn't exist for our ancestors, like reading or complex math.
So it's like our brains are saying, we've got this area that's great at recognizing faces. Let's tweak it a bit to handle letters, too. It's amazingly efficient.
Exactly. This neuronal recycling process helps explain how we humans have developed such a vast array of complex skills, from composing symphonies to designing skyscrapers to writing the very code that powers the technology we use every day.
It's incredible to think that our brains have this remarkable capacity to build upon their existing structures to create something entirely new.
And this understanding of neuronal recycling has major implications for the field of education. Imagine if we could pinpoint the neural circuits behind specific skills, we could design teaching methods that leverage those circuits, making learning much more effective.
So rather than teaching reading as a standalone skill, we might connect it to those pre-existing visual recognition skills. Or when we're teaching math, we could emphasize the links to spatial reasoning and quantity estimation. It's a whole new way of thinking about curriculum development.
Precisely. It's all about aligning our teaching methods with how our brains naturally learn. And speaking of aligning with our natural tendencies, Dehaene also emphasizes the importance of social learning.
Right, we're not just solo learners, we're part of a collaborative learning community.
Exactly. Humans are incredibly social learners. We're wired for shared attention, imitation, and the transmission of knowledge through our culture. Just look at how babies learn language. It's not just about passively absorbing words. They're actively engaged with their caregivers, paying attention to their gaze, mimicking their sounds, and picking up on social cues. It's a remarkably efficient learning strategy.
And this social learning doesn't stop in childhood.
Hmm.
We continue to learn from others throughout our lives, whether through formal education, apprenticeships, mentorship, or just by observing and interacting with the people around us. Think about how much we learn from our colleagues, friends, and family members every single day.
Desagne argues that this social dimension of learning is one of the key factors that has allowed us to develop such complex cultures and societies. We're not just individual learners, we're part of a vast interconnected network of knowledge sharing and collaboration.
It's like having a built-in network of mentors and collaborators who are constantly feeding our brains new information and helping us make sense of the world around us.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of creating learning environments that foster collaboration, communication, and shared exploration.
So group projects, classroom discussions, and peer-to-peer learning activities aren't just nice additions to the curriculum. They're actually tapping into a fundamental aspect of how we learn best.
Precisely. And this leads us to another critical element for effective learning: curiosity.
Curiosity. The driving force behind countless scientific discoveries, works of art, and entrepreneurial endeavors. What role does curiosity play in our brains from a neuroscientific standpoint?
Dehaene is clear that curiosity isn't just a personality quirk. It's a powerful driver of learning, and it's deeply rooted in the brain's reward system. When we're curious about something, our brains release dopamine, that neurotransmitter is associated with pleasure and motivation. This dopamine surge reinforces the learning process and makes us more likely to seek out new information and experiences.
So it's not just about passively receiving information, it's about actively seeking it out, driven by a genuine desire to understand, explore, and unravel the mysteries of the world around us.
Exactly. It's about cultivating curiosity both within ourselves and in others. When we're curious, we're more engaged, more persistent, and more likely to see patterns and make connections that others might miss.
That makes me wonder, how can we foster curiosity in ourselves and in others? Is it something we're born with, or is it a skill we can develop?
While some people might be naturally more curious than others, Dehaene suggests that curiosity is a skill that can be cultivated. He recommends creating environments that encourage exploration, experimentation, and questioning. He also suggests surrounding ourselves with people who are curious, ask thought-provoking questions, and are passionate about learning.
So instead of just providing answers, we should be encouraging questions. Instead of shutting down tangents, we should be embracing them. Instead of fearing the unknown, we should be diving in with a sense of wonder and excitement.
It's about fostering a culture of curiosity where exploration is celebrated, mistakes are seen as learning opportunities, and the pursuit of knowledge is a joyful adventure.
And this brings us back to another important point, that Dehaene emphasizes the role of errors in learning.
Yes, it's worth reiterating errors are not the enemy, they're actually essential for growth.
As the saying goes, we learn more from our failures than our successes. Why is that from a neuroscientific perspective? Why are errors so valuable?
Remember, our brains are constantly making predictions about the world based on what we currently understand. When those predictions turn out to be wrong, that's when the error detection mechanism kicks in, and that's what triggers learning. It's a feedback loop, letting us know, hey, something isn't quite right here. Time to adjust our understanding.
So instead of seeing errors as setbacks, we should see them as valuable feedback that helps us build a more accurate model of how things work.
Exactly. This goes hand in hand with the concept of a growth mindset, which Desagne also discusses in the book. When we embrace errors as learning opportunities, we become more resilient, more willing to take risks, and more persistent in the face of challenges.
It's about reframing our thinking. Instead of saying, I'm bad at this, we can say, I'm not good at this yet, but I'm learning. It's a subtle shift, but it can make a world of difference.
It can now. To wrap up this deep dive, let's explore some concrete learning strategies rooted in the science of memory. Dehaene talks about some specific techniques that are particularly effective.
I'm all ears. We've touched on active learning and spaced repetition, but I'm ready for more tools to add to my learning toolkit.
Great Dehaene highlights one technique called retrieval practice. It's all about making an active effort to recall information from memory.
So instead of just passively rereading notes or listening to a lecture, I should be actively quizzing myself, explaining concepts from memory, or doing other activities that force me to retrieve the information.
Exactly. This works because it strengthens those neural pathways associated with that information. The more effort we put into recalling something, the stronger the memory becomes.
It's like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Perfect analogy, along with retrieval practice. Dehaene also stresses the value of spaced repetition, which we talked about earlier.
That's the technique where you review information at increasing intervals, right? Like seeing a flashcard today, then a few days later, then a week later, and so on.
Yeah. That's right. And it works because it takes advantage of something called the forgetting curve when we start to forget something. Our brains actually have to work a little harder to retrieve it the next time we encounter it, which ends up strengthening the memory trace.
So it's not about cramming information into our short-term memory. It's about strategically spacing out our learning sessions to allow our brains to consolidate the information more effectively.
Precisely. And another technique Dehaene recommends is called interleaving. This involves mixing up different topics or types of problems during study sessions.
So instead of tackling all the math problems at once and then moving on to history, we should be switching back and forth between different subjects or types of problems.
That's right. Interleaving keeps our brains from getting too comfortable and forces us to make connections between different concepts. It's like cross-training for the brain.
These techniques are so fascinating. It makes me realize that effective learning is about strategy, understanding how our brains work, and then using that knowledge to optimize our learning process.
And that's one of the key takeaways from Dehaene's book. He argues that understanding the neuroscience of learning can truly empower us to become better learners, no matter what our age or background might be. It's like having this incredible user's manual for our own brains, a set of tools and techniques that can help us unlock our full learning potential.
It really makes you appreciate the power of understanding how our brains learn. And speaking of empowering tools in the book, Dehaene outlines several evidence-based learning strategies, and it's clear that he's a big proponent of retrieval practice.
Retrieval practice is all about actively recalling information from memory. So instead of just passively rereading your notes or listening to a podcast, you would quiz yourself, try to explain concepts without looking at your notes, or engage in activities that really make you work to retrieve that information.
It's like, if I really want to remember something, I shouldn't just read it over and over again. I should actually try to recall it without looking. Does that mean flashcards and self-testing are my new best friends?
They certainly can be. The reason retrieval practice is so effective is that it forces your brain to work harder, which strengthens the neural connections associated with that information. The more effort you put into retrieving something, the stronger the memory becomes.
It's like the more you use a muscle, the stronger it gets.
Yeah.
So by regularly testing myself and trying to retrieve information, I'm essentially giving my brain a workout.
Exactly. And along with retrieval practice, Dehaene emphasizes the importance of spaced repetition, which we talked about earlier. Reviewing information at increasing intervals really capitalizes on that forgetting curve. When we forget something, our brain has to work harder to retrieve it the next time, and that strengthens the memory even more.
It's not about cramming information in and hoping it sticks. It's about giving our brains the time and space they need to consolidate information
Yeah.
to the long haul. So I want to revisit that tricky concept a few times over a period of days or weeks, right?
Right now, another powerful technique Dehaene highlights is interleaving. Have you ever tried mixing up different subjects or types of problems while you're studying?
I have to admit, I usually stick to one subject at a time. I figure it's better to focus all my energy on one thing before moving on to the next, but I'm sensing that might not be the best approach.
Dehaene would say it's worth trying a different approach with interleaving. You might do a few math problems, then switch to reviewing some history notes, and then maybe tackle a few lines of code, and then back to math. It keeps your brain on its toes and forces it to make connections between different concepts.
So it's like cross-training for the brain. Instead of specializing in one mental exercise, I'm working out different cognitive muscles, which makes my brain more flexible and adaptable.
Exactly. And all of these techniques, retrieval practice, spaced repetition, and interleaving, are rooted in the science of how our brains form and retrieve memories. By understanding these principles, we can learn more efficiently and hold on to that knowledge longer.
Dehaene's book has been such a fascinating exploration of the brain's incredible capacity for learning. It's really changed how I think about learning, both for myself and for others.
It's a powerful reminder that anyone can be a good learner. It's not about some innate talent or intelligence. It's about understanding how our brains learn best and then applying that knowledge strategically.
If you're looking for more practical tips and insights, or simply want to explore the captivating world of neuroscience and learning, I highly recommend checking out How We Learn by Stanislas Dehaene.
It's a book that has the potential to change the way you approach learning, parenting, education, and even workplace training.
And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, questioning, and expanding your understanding of the world. Because as we've learned today, learning is an adventure that we get to enjoy throughout our lives. Our brains are pretty amazing guides for that journey.
We'll leave you with one final thought to ponder: if our brains are constantly generating hypotheses and seeking new information, how can we create environments at home, at school, and the workplace that truly foster curiosity and encourage that active exploration in our everyday lives?
That's something for us all to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into how we learn. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing and those curiosity fires burning bright.